Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Concepts and Pingdom. I'm John Voorhees, and with me as always is Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You know, we had teased before that we were going to start doing a series of interviews over the summer, just kind of leading up to the OS releases this fall, going over some of the things we saw in WWDC now that people have had a little bit more of a chance to think about them and start playing around with things and trying things. And so today we are going to start that with our very first interview. And we have this week Guilherme Rambo. He has joined us. Welcome to the show, Guy.
Hi, John. Hi, Tichi. How are you doing?
Hey, Guy. It's nice to have you here. Is it the first time on App Stories?
I think it is.
Yes, this is my first time. I think it's my first time talking to John.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we didn't have a chance to meet each other at WWDC in San Jose, and boy, that's what a missed opportunity now that we didn't have it in person this year, and who knows where this is all going. But yeah, it's good to talk to you. I want, for listeners who don't know, Guy has a bunch of apps like Chibi Studio and Fusion Cast and AirBuddy. I use AirBuddy all the time. I really love that app. I'm so glad you made it because it just makes moving around to my AirPods and things so much easier. And of course, he's also one of the hosts of Stack Trace, the podcast for developers. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to have him on the show and talk about things like SwiftUI and Mac Catalyst and some of the things we're seeing in iPad OS and that sort of thing.
Awesome. By the way, I know you're a fan of AirBuddy, and I have you at the top of my list for the 2.0 beta. So as soon as I get that going, you're going to be the first one to know about it.
All right,
Look
perfect.
at you,
I can't
Mr.
wait to try that
Voorhees,
out.
getting betas of Mac apps. Nice.
Yes, well, somebody's got to do it,
You're so
Federico. It is MacStories after all. It's MacStories, Federico. Don't forget.
I know.
All right. Well, Guy, let's get started because I just wrote a story really recently about Mac Catalyst. And, one of the things is I was looking back and thinking about where we've come. It started out as Project Sneak Peek, which was not even really named back in 2018 at WWDC, where Craig Federighi got up on stage and explained, that there was going to be a way for developers to get their apps from the iPad onto the Mac. And he revealed that there were 4 initial apps that Apple had ported themselves. And, the reality is they weren't great apps. Things like Stocks, News, Home, and Voice Memos, I guess, were the first 4. And then in 2019, the developers actually got the tools, got their hands on them. And, I think Apple maybe oversold it a little bit as kind of a checkbox type of system where you check a box, build your app, and all of a sudden you've got a Mac app. And it didn't really work out that way. There were some really nice apps that came out, but it was the ones that were the best took a lot more work to get to fit in and follow some of the standard Mac conventions. And then this year in 2020, Apple took things a step further. There are a lot more tools that were revealed for Mac Catalyst and are now available, including optimized for Mac, which to me is really intriguing. And I wanted to ask you, what's going on with Mac Catalyst? I mean, what's your take on what we saw at WWDC this year? Is Apple listening to developers? Was this all part of a grander plan to begin with? What's the deal with all this?
I do have a feeling that this is where they wanted to go towards when they started. Mm-hmm. It's changed a lot under the hood. Even like the first year, those apps, they were basically like the iOS simulator in a window. That was basically it. Right. It was a little bit more than that, but the gist of it was like you're running this iPad app on your Mac, and it was using some crazy thing where the iOS app would run in a certain process, and the window would be a different process. And with Catalyst last year, they introduced a new model, which is this unified process model where your UIKit app basically is a Mac app, even though it's using UIKit, but it's a lot more native in a sense. But of course, the UI still looks different because it's running on the Mac, but it's using the UI from iPad OS, basically. But this year, they went further than that with Optimized for Mac. And that's basically a new idiom. So it's using the Mac idiom, so the Mac look in controls. And through the exploration of friends, such as our friend Steve Troughton-Smith, we now know that they're actually embedding AppKit controls in your UIKit app to achieve that, which is quite amazing and quite scary in some sense. But yeah, I think I do feel like this was their plan from the beginning, but they probably knew they wouldn't be able to achieve that in a quick and fast way, so they just went progressively improving it.
And as a developer, Guy, do you feel more incentivized, maybe, if you were to bring one of your iPad or iOS apps to the Mac? Do you feel like with the updated Catalyst this year, do you feel like, oh, maybe this is something that I can do now that I'm actually interested in?
It's funny because I get asked, not this particular question, but developers often ask me the question, like, I'm going to make a new app now. What should I use?
Right.
Like, should I use UI kits and make a Catalyst version for the Mac? Should I go SwiftUI and then I can share some code between the platforms, but it's still going to be a native app in all platforms? If I go with Catalyst, should I use the optimized for Mac version? Should I use the other version? And it's honestly something I struggle with. I do have a few new projects in the pipeline, and one of them is an iOS app primarily for the iPhone, but it's also going to have an iPad version if I ever ship it, because it's one of those projects where I don't have a commitment to actually shipping it. But I am probably going to want to have a Mac version for it. And then there's the question, like, should I go with the Catalyst version that looks like an iPad app with just a little bit of improvement around being more usable on the Mac, or should I go all in and try to make it like a Mac app? And I'm honestly confused. Like, I'm not sure where to go. I think I am thinking about, and I'm revealing my plans here, but with FusionCast, I started the app with the intent of eventually having it on the iPad as well, because I think it is a good fit for the iPad. And the core technology it uses to render video is the same between the Mac and iPad. And I've actually tested like my rendering engine on the iPad, and it's really fast. It's faster than the Mac. So with FusionCast, I do plan on, when I make like a big new version, maybe a 2.0 or something, I'm going to do the reverse, basically. It's currently an AppKit app on the Mac, and I'm thinking about redoing the whole UI using UIKit and keeping the Mac version Catalyst, but with the optimized for Mac thing so that it looks like a native Mac app.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I can kind of see how you're coming to that conclusion, because my sense is that for a lot of apps, SwiftUI, although it's kind of moved by leaps and bounds in just a very short period of time, there's still a lot of roadblocks there when people are trying to build the entire app starting with SwiftUI. Is that your sense too?
Yeah, I do agree. And we talk about that on StackTrace a lot. And the strategy I've been using, and even at my job, which I am an engineering manager for the mobile team, and we are starting to use SwiftUI in some parts of the app. And the way we're doing it is not like, of course, we're not rewriting the entire app in SwiftUI. That would be crazy. Right. It's a huge app, but a new feature that we're developing is going to use SwiftUI, but only for things that go inside other things, basically. So we're not structuring the whole app around, or the whole feature around SwiftUI, but rather creating these little components, so these little rectangles on screen that contain SwiftUI. And Apple has made that quite easy, fortunately, so it's very easy for you to interoperate. And the new app I'm making, which is primarily for the iPhone, which I mentioned is a hobby project, I am also doing the same technique. So I'm still using UIKit to structure the large building blocks of the app and the architecture. But individual components, I am writing in SwiftUI because that's where it shines right now, in my opinion. I think it still has quite a lot to go before it's more usable as a way to structure your entire app from scratch.
Right. So you're talking about things like individual views within the app is what you'd use SwiftUI for, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And with Mac Catalyst, to me, it's interesting because last year when we were at WWDC, there was a lot of confusion about Mac Catalyst because SwiftUI was announced at the same time, and SwiftUI, it feels like the future. I mean, I think Apple has effectively said that's the future across all these platforms, but it's still a future that's pretty far out there. And Mac Catalyst, to me now, especially with the optimized for Mac, it shows a greater commit, and the fact that Apple built messages and maps with it this year, that Apple's more committed to Mac Catalyst, and that is actually going to be one of the main ways, I think, especially for people who have existing UIKit apps, to bring those apps over to the Mac, at least for a while now. I mean, I don't think it's deprecated right out of the box as was suggested, or that it's like a 1-year thing. It's going to be around for a while, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. It does have a long way to go. If you think about UIKit and where it came from, which was AppKit, it wasn't like based on AppKit. It was a brand new thing, but its whole philosophy was based on AppKit, which at the time I think was already like 10 years old or maybe even more. So UIKit is a technology that's been evolving for 2 decades, basically, even though it doesn't exist since 20 years ago, but it has been evolving, and it's a long time for a technology like this to evolve. And that has its drawbacks, but it also has its benefits. The drawbacks are that there are some things that are old and clunky because it is old technology that has to be interoperable with old things and things like that. But at the same time, it's very mature, so there is a lot of polish in how it works and its behaviors, and things don't tend to break very often. They do, but it's not that often. And with SwiftUI, you have a thing that's basically been around for a year. Like it was in development a little bit longer than that, but it has been in the hands of developers for a little over a year. So we can't expect it to be as mature, as polished as something like UIKit.
Right. And there's so many alternatives for building apps now. I thought it was really interesting, too, this year that Apple threw yet another curveball at everybody, which is running native iOS and iPadOS apps on Apple Silicon when those computers ship later this year. I mean, does that change the calculus for developers, do you think?
Honestly, for me, it does have an impact because, as you mentioned, I have Chibi Studio, and it's mainly an iPad and an iPhone app, and I think mostly even an iPhone app. Most people use it on their iPhone. And we do have a Catalyst version, an internal version that is a Catalyst version that we've been playing around with for a while, but it doesn't feel like it makes sense for us to ship something like that because there is no market for it. Like, it doesn't really make sense for us to even do the small investment, which comparatively to like making an AppKit Mac app is a really small investment, but even then it is an investment, and it is something that we have to keep improving and supporting and making sure it works for a really small market that doesn't really change much for us. So I think our case is an example of an app that will probably benefit a lot from Apple Silicon. And if you really, really want to use Chibi Studio on the Mac, you can just run the iPad version. It's going to be fine. Like, it's not going to look like a Mac app or anything, but it's going to be fine.
This episode of App Stories and all of our MacStories Summer OS preview series is brought to you by Concepts. Concepts is an infinite canvas app that offers endless idea exploration. It's ideal for visual thinking, note-taking, mind mapping, storyboards, sketching, illustration, graphic design, product design, and architecture. Sketch, design, and communicate your ideas with liquid ink, editable vector lines, and flexible exports that work with any app. Create great-looking notes and drawings with the Designer Copic color palette licensed by 2 Corporation. Movable vector lines allow you to organize and edit your ideas with simple gestures. Drag and drop images, vector objects, and text straight onto the canvas for quick ideating and sketching. Design tools like grids, snap, shape guides, and scale measurement enable polished professional sketching for architects and designers. An automatic presentation mode lets you connect your device to a display for instant live sharing too. The app's PDF feature allows you to mark up, edit, and create and sign documents as well. The app is used by designers and illustrators at Apple, Disney, HP, Nike, PlayStation, Unity, and a whole lot of other companies globally to sketch, design, and communicate visually. Concepts comes free as a basic sketching app, which is a great way to get started. And it has the ability to unlock features via a subscription or one-time purchase. To learn more about Concepts, go to concepts.app. Again, that URL is concepts.app to learn more about this great Infinite Canvas app. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of the show.
All right, I want to switch gears and talk about iPadOS for a few minutes. Most of the changes that we've seen at WWDC for iPad were falling under the Made for iPad sort of initiative. So this idea that Apple is taking better advantage of the larger screen of the iPad, and so they're now introducing elements such as sidebars, for example, and these new toolbar menus, pull-down menus, this different way of designing iPad apps, sort of moving away from the iPhone-inspired app design with the top bars at the bottom, just to take better advantage of the bigger screen. Now, obviously, these iPad apps. So you take a look at Photos, for example, or all the other apps that got a sidebar this year in terms of Apple's built-in apps. I mean, even voice memos got a sidebar. They do sort of look like Mac versions of what they used to be. So how do you feel about this sort of the Mac and iPad influencing each other? So obviously you have the iPad coming to the Mac with Catalyst and even iPad apps running natively on Apple Silicon, but you also have the other way around happening with the Mac sort of influencing app design on iPad. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, I think the iPad has a lot to learn from the Mac. As you probably know, being an iPad user and with people often saying to you, you should just use a Mac.
No, do they?
Yeah, I can imagine. So they do have a lot to learn from each other in both directions, like you mentioned. And I do like the direction they're going towards with this year's redesigns. And it was one of those years where right after installing the first beta, I was basically just launching every single first-party app just to check it out. And it did inspire me, and I am actually working on a redesign for Chibi Studio on the iPad to take advantage of this new design language. I can actually show it to you. I'll send it exclusively to you, Vitici, so you can check it out.
MacStories exclusive. Thank you. Yes. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so I do like it. I think it gives a lot of freedom to developers to explore the iPad a little bit more, because the way it used to work with tab bars, it works really well on iPhone, but it really, when you think about it, it doesn't really make sense on iPad to have a tab bar at the bottom. It makes way more sense to have a sidebar. And it also makes me think that maybe Apple has finally realized that people use their iPads in landscape and not in portrait.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good point, because when you it's exactly what you said. When you think about it, like an iPhone, it makes sense to have tabs at the bottom because you're holding a phone And, with your thumb, it's very easy to reach to the bottom of the display and change sections using tabs. But with an iPad, especially the iPad Pro, you're mostly using the device in landscape, and I would argue that you're mostly using it with a keyboard attached. So I feel like this design, not only does it work better for a device that is mostly using landscape, but really it works better for a device that you're likely using with a keyboard. And if you're an iPad Pro user, I think it's very likely that you've either bought a Magic Keyboard or at the very least you're using an external trackpad or mouse. And so when you consider all these factors together, it makes sense to have a sidebar in landscape, and it's easier to use when you have a pointer and you can just go there and click. So I definitely think that they're finally maybe accepting this reality of the iPhone and iPad being different.
Federico, I'll believe it when the Apple logo is landscape.
That's a good point.
I'd like to see that if we get an update this fall. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what we see.
Yeah.
The other sort of a Mac inspired change from WWDC and Guy, I hope that your technical knowledge will make this easier for folks like us to understand this. Is the deeper keyboard integration, especially when it comes to gaming. So this idea that you can now use the pointer and the keyboard for proper sort of a PC-like gaming on iPad. Have you looked at all into this stuff?
I have not, but I am familiar with the changes they've made. So before you couldn't, we call it capture the cursor. So when you're playing like a first-person shooter or something like that, the game will capture your mouse cursor. So it doesn't really, when you move on the trackpad, it's not moving a cursor on screen. It's just moving this virtual object or moving the camera or something like that. So they made that possible now with new API on iPadOS 14 so that apps can capture the cursor and do whatever they want with it, which is really, really good.
That's really interesting. It's going to be, I think Apple with gaming is just such a strange story. They, every year there's some sort of game related. We also, this year there's Game Center finally got some love for the first time in just years. Plus, there's even deeper controller support. And I've never been convinced that Apple really gets gaming beyond kind of casual mobile gaming, but they seem to keep trying different things. So, maybe something will stick at some point. I'm not sure.
Yeah, to me, it feels like Apple's main interest in gaming is their services revenue,
right.
Like the 30% they get from the Candy Crushes of the App Store and things like that, and also, of course, Apple Arcade. But there was even this crazy rumor recently that they were going to release a gaming notebook, which is like, what? Apple releasing a gaming laptop? That would be crazy. So I don't know. And there's also another rumor, and I've been told that this is actually quite possible, that they're going to release a beefier version of the Apple TV, like a new version of the Apple TV that's going to be way more powerful so that it can run games better and run better games as well. So that's also could be seen as an investment towards the gaming market.
Yeah, it seems like it's about time for the Apple TV to get refreshed with new processor in it. And I guess with Apple Silicon too, we're potentially going to get much faster notebooks and other computers out of Apple. So yeah, I could see those becoming gaming rigs. I think part of the problem, though, it feels like is the reliance on things like metal, because I just don't know if, for the bigger game studios, whether they really want to port their games to an entirely different technology.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I think that's why Apple keeps a very good relationship with companies such as Unity, which is a huge provider of gaming APIs and a gaming engine and platform. I think their relationship with Unity is really important to keep these games in Apple's platforms. And I think it was even mentioned during the Apple Silicon section in the keynote, where they are already working to get their SDK ready for Apple Silicon.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pingdom from SolarWinds. While you've been listening to this podcast, how would you know if your website had gone down? Would you know if your customers couldn't click that Buy Now button or access your content? You might stumble across the problem by luck on your own, but that's no good. You need a system. You need something to tell you everything is running smoothly on your site, and more importantly, when it's not. You need Pingdom. Pingdom detects around 13 million outages every single month. That's more than 400,000 outages every day. Pingdom helps keep your sites and the sites you love online. It doesn't matter if you're a startup or a Fortune 500 company. You need alerts about any critical website issues. They'll let you customize how you're alerted depending on the severity of the outage. Plus, they'll track and analyze your website's load time so you can see what's affecting your user experience. And Pingdom has a no-fuss approach to getting started. All they need is the URL you want to monitor, and they'll take care of the rest. Go to pingdom.com/signup right now for a 14-day free trial with no credit card required. And when you're ready to sign up, use the code AppStories at checkout to get a huge 30% off your first invoice. Again, that's pingdom.com/signup and the code AppStories to get a huge 30% off your first invoice. Our thanks to Pingdom from Solar Winds for their support of the show. So, Guy, when you look at the landscape of what was announced this year at WWDC, where do you think the biggest opportunities are this year for third-party developers?
Oh, that's a great question. I can't reveal too much here. This is like
because these are all the things you're doing, right?
I'm kidding. Well, one of the things, and I could be wrong here, and I could be just excited about something, but one of the things that's really interesting to me is app clips. I think they have big potential to be these mini apps that, at the same time where Apple says that widgets are not mini apps, app clips are exactly that. They're mini apps. And of course, it's the example use case that they give is like payment solutions or rentals and things like that. But there are creative ways you can use app clips. So I think developers should keep that in mind, and as a way to give users a taste of their app. Let's say you are bringing in users through your own website. Your users can possibly tap a link on your website and they can try your app out before even launching the App Store. I think that's a great opportunity for developers. And of course, I can't not mention widgets, which is also a huge thing. And it's interesting because both of these are things that we don't know and we can't know how well they're gonna do. Like, it could very well be the next iMessage app store, like that.
Right.
All of these developers will make widgets and no one's gonna use them. Or it could be the opposite and it could be a huge thing. We don't know, but I think these two are great opportunities.
Yeah, I can tell you that, I'm sorry, John, I can tell you that a few nights ago I was out at dinner with friends just here in Rome. And I took out my phone because I needed to send a text. And as soon as I unlocked my phone, like a friend, she was sitting next to me and she looked at my home screen and she was like, "What's that?" And by that, she meant that I had two widgets on my home screen. And I explained, this is the next version. What I basically, every summer, I need to explain to somebody because they're like, and how do you have it? Why the question is always, why does Apple give you an operating system ahead of time? And I'm like, well, it's not like
you're special.
It's not like they give it to me. Everybody can use. Anyway, but yeah, the widgets immediately stood out, and I had notes and the calendar. And usually this is a good sign. Like when there's a feature and one of your non-techie friends, they notice the feature and they get it almost immediately. Usually it's a good sign. And it wasn't the case for iMessage apps or, some of the more esoteric notification features, for example, a couple of years ago. So I feel pretty optimistic about widgets myself.
Yeah, I think the same thing happened last year with dark mode
Yes.
when I was using the beta around the non-techie people, and they were like, "How did you do that? What's different with your phone?" I think that's also a good sign. And these days, I see a lot of people using dark mode.
What I was going to ask you, Guy, is about the widgets and the lack of interactivity. Do you think that's driven by the limitations of SwiftUI, or do you think that that is more of a something else is driving that?
I don't think it's SwiftUI necessarily. I think it's mostly probably Apple worried about performance and battery life implications, because even though we do have these very powerful devices, there's always a balance that needs to be struck between using the CPU and GPU and radios and preserving battery life, because physics, right? We have this limited space. We need this battery to fit, and we can't be pegging the CPU and the radios all the time. People underestimate the amount of energy these devices spend powering up, like your Wi-Fi or your 4G LTE radios. That's a huge cost in terms of energy. And if you have a widget that's doing a lot of networking, downloading things from some service to display information, that can be a huge cost to battery life. And so I do think that it has a little bit to do, and probably mostly to do, with preserving battery life. But I also think it's a little bit of that Apple thing of, we don't want these to become mini apps. So instead of using the App Store review like we used in the past to like block the pcalc widget, remember that story?
Right, yep.
Let's just do it in a way where developers simply can't make them fully interactive. And I would be surprised if next year we don't get a little bit or maybe a lot of these limitations lifted.
I mean, I certainly hope so.
Yeah.
So we were just a few minutes ago, just to go back to the discussion surrounding the iPadOS and iPad apps coming to the Mac. What do you feel about sort of the overall implications in terms of like the economics of it? Do you feel like the iPad apps and Catalyst and all these different ways to now bring over your application to the Mac, do you feel like that has the potential to fundamentally change the App Store market on the Mac, which has been, quite honestly, a bit, slow would be a nice way to put it, over the past few years? Do you feel like Apple is sort of repositioning itself to have a more vibrant ecosystem on the Mac? Do you think that's even possible at this point? Or do you feel like, yes, there will be apps on the Mac App Store, but the Mac market will still primarily be, you go to a website and you purchase an application from a developer's website, and the Mac App Store is not nearly as popular as the iOS App Store?
Yeah, I don't think it's ever going to be as popular as the iOS App Store, of course. I do feel like this movement is going to turn the Mac App Store into an App Store, basically, because there is very little stuff in the Mac App Store. And it's funny because sometimes I do have one app in the Mac App Store, and sometimes it will sell like 10 copies in any particular territory, and it's going to be in like the top charts,
right,
from selling like 10 units. So, and it's not just me. You can ask any Mac developer that has Mac apps in the Mac App Store, and that happens a lot. Like you sell 10 copies in some country, and you go to the top charts. It's
very sad when you think about it.
That's how sad the Mac App Store is. But I do think that with these other apps coming to the Mac App Store, it is going to make a difference. It's also going to be interesting to see maybe developers explore the advantages of the Mac, one of which is your ability to distribute your apps outside the Mac App Store, which is not going to change. And Apple was very clear in their communication during the Apple Silicon sessions and things like that is not going to change. And we know of people who got the DTK, and it's fully hackable, so
nice.
They aren't like locking it down like an iPhone or an iPad. So it's going to be interesting. Like, let's say I have some app in the iOS App Store, and for some reason there's something I would like to do on the Mac that wouldn't be allowed in the Mac App Store. Maybe use some private API to do some cool thing or integrate with the system in a way that's not allowed. It will be interesting to see if at least part of the developers are going to take advantage of that difference between the platforms. I think we're going to have some interesting situations happening with the whole iOS apps on the Mac thing. There are also, and this is something I think many developers aren't even thinking about, but there are significant security implications from your iOS app running on the Mac, which basically means like any Mac is basically jailbroken, and I'm doing air quotes here, but it's almost as if any of your apps could be running on a jailbroken device at any moment. So developers are going to have to be more careful about security. They can't rely anymore on, the system is fully locked down and it's impossible to break into. So that's also going to be an interesting aspect. And I wouldn't be surprised, and I think that's going to be the main reason why we're not going to be seeing apps such as Netflix and YouTube in the Mac App Store. I think they're going to opt out.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really considered that. I mean, I guess, though, as somebody who's done an awful lot of poking around in the system, you probably have a pretty good sense for that, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of that, I wanted to ask you, how do you go about dissecting a new beta when it comes out?
Well, I haven't been doing that much this year because I'm very busy with the work, the jobby job, and my other projects. Mm-hmm. But it's not a complicated process. Apple distributes the betas as packages, and you can basically download them from whatever, the developer portal or some websites that have the lists of links. And you can basically, it's a zip file that you extract, and you have the whole file system there, and then you can do whatever you want. You can list the files, compare with the previous beta, compare individual files, and go from there. It's quite a meticulous process.
So my last question for you is more about the workflow of all of this. So do you keep notes? Do you have a system to keep track of changes over the years? Or do you just remember it all in your head? Do you have, I don't know, a database of notes or something? How do you keep track of all these small changes through the course of multiple years and dozens of betas?
I do have a bash script that I wrote.
Of course you do.
That, sorry, it's not an automator or a shortcuts thing, but it's a bash script that basically takes a folder to the root file system of an iOS build, and it will run a bunch of stuff that will extract information such as lists of files and strings and images and things like that, and output a bunch of text files. So I can do that for every release and every build, and I can basically put those text files into things such as BBEdit, which has a great diffing algorithm, really fast. I'm sometimes diffing text files of hundreds of megabytes. And you can do it.
Wow.
And you can do it with Kaleidoscope and other tools like that. But I do keep a lot in my head, but I do have I have, what is it called? Is a collection in Ulysses, or a section in Ulysses, which is basically, instead of being blog posts or something like that, it's just a bunch of notes that I have there about things that I found and things that I should do more research on.
Nice. Yeah, the script that does the extracting for you, that sounds really, really nice. Yeah, I've always been curious about this stuff, so I'm glad that I was able to ask you about it.
Awesome.
Well, Guy, I want to thank you for joining us today. I think that's probably a good place to stop. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
I want to thank our two sponsors again for this show, and that is Concepts and Pingdom. Of course, you can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net every week. Federico and I are also on Twitter and Instagram, as is Guy. Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And where can people find you, Guy?
They can find me on Twitter. I am at _insides, and I'm also on the Stack Trace podcast, which you can find on 9to5mac.com.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely check out Stack Trace. It's a great show, and I really enjoy kind of the deep dive that you do on the show. And of course, you can find me too on Instagram and Twitter at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.